Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. We are very delighted to have another remote speaker in a hybrid sort of in-person room with us today. We have Yasheng Huang, the Epic Foundation Professor of International Management, Professor of Global Economics and Management, and Faculty Director of Action Learning at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He's currently involved in multiple research projects, most of which focus on the political economy of China, historical, technological, and political developments in China, and he is co-PI on a food safety in China project. His new book, The Rise and Fall of the East, Examination, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology in Chinese History and Today, will be published by Yale University Press in 2023, and we will be hearing a little bit from that book today. Yasheng.
Thank you very much, Didi. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to give this seminar at CDDRL. So this is on history, and I'm going to explain it's based on one chapter of the forthcoming book. The book itself is very, very broad, and this chapter is also very broad because it covers historical technology. So let me just say a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to go into the presentation on technology in Chinese history. It's the rise and the fall of the East. East is not a geographic reference. It is examination, autocracy, stability, and technology. So today's talk is on the T component of that East formulation in Chinese history and today. So it's very broad, four big topics, both history and contemporary period. It's forthcoming from Yale University Press 2023. So let me just go quickly over the outline of the book. The first chapter is introduction, unpacking the East model, what that is. And then I'm going into examination, right? So one chapter is on the, essentially the way I see it is that the Chinese imperial civil service exam was the instrument that scaled the country. So it's a scaling instrument. And then a chapter on Communist Party as an organization, rather than as a political system, but really as an organization. And then autocracy, go back to history again, chapter 4, meritocratic autocracy. And then chapter 5 on contemporary period, which is about this kind of a brief period of political liberalization in the 1980s. And then since then, it has become increasingly autocratic and power consolidation. And Xi Jinping is really at the apex of that rather than a sudden move. And stability, so one chapter is on the longevity of the Chinese imperial system, over 2,000 years in duration, and what explained that stability. And then chapter 7 is about communist period again. So if you think about communist China, CCP, it has handled lots of things, how should I put it? It has maintained stability despite the odds, right? So great leap forward, Cultural Revolution. One thing it has not been able to do very well is succession. Succession has been a source of instability. And I believe that that source of instability is going to haunt China again under Xi Jinping. So that's what the chapter is about. And technology, so chapter 8 is really the chapter that I'm going to present today, is on history. I also have chapter 9, which is on contemporary technological development. And then the last part is kind of looking forward, debating the future of this model. And there's this narrative of rising East and declining West. And then the final chapter is mostly about policy implications, how the West can come through terms with the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so that's the rundown of the book. And we have other projects, both on history and on contemporary period. Some of them use the same database that I'm going to present today. I have a paper with Claire Yang forthcoming from Journal of Politics, the longevity mechanism of Chinese absolutism. I have another paper with Claire on the Great Divergence. Usually when historians talk about Great Divergence, they mean the economic divergence in the 17th, 18th centuries. Ours is about political divergence, which happened actually much earlier between the West and the East. And then there's this famous idea in Chinese history about the great Tang Song transition. And we're not contributing anything new other than that we use data to look at the effects of that Tang Song transition. And then we're working on another book on historical technology using the database that I'm going to use to present my work today. And it's a collaboration with a number of Chinese academics. Okay, so let me go through the outline of the talk today. And so Didi, you keep me informed about my time. So just let me know when I should shut up. So I'm going to start with a preview of results and main contributions. I know sometimes it's hard to get to the end, so I want to make sure that at least you walk away with some idea of the kind of results we have generated and the insights that we have generated. And then I'm going to introduce the database, the Chinese historical invention data set, and the measures of Chinese inventiveness. We also have measures, although very crude, on kind of ideological diversity. So I'm going to also introduce those measures as well. And then I'm going to present the patterns of a historical technology. And then, so this is getting to the explanation part of the presentation. So I'm going to explain the pattern by first discussing state capacity. And secondly, discussing what I call contestability conditions, the scope, right? Diversity, basically, sort of scale. We tend to think about scale as a very large something of the same thing. A scope, we tend to think about sort of different things and diversity, right? So my whole book is actually about this trade-off between scale and scope. I use that not just to explain technology, I also use it to explain the autocracy and stability. And so so that idea runs through the entire book. And then I'm going to end drawing some broader implications from the findings, specifically on the current era in China. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of the presentation. So let me go to the preview of results and the main contributions, right? So basically, from the data that we have created, we can identify kind of 3 eras of Chinese technology, right? So if you sort of think about Chinese history as starting from, say, 5th century BCE, and then ended in 1911, the last dynasty. So for those sort of 2,400 years, there are 3 eras of technology. The peak era, the first era, lasted from the 4th century BCE to 6th century, right? 6th century. So roughly about 1,000 years. The second era, and that was already an era of decline, started from the 6th century to 13th century. So that's the peak to the 6th century, and then the first decline, the second era, roughly 700 years. And then the third era is from 13th, 14th century to basically the beginning of the 20th century. And that's another decline, right? So if you, I'm going to show a graph later on, right? The peak, China peaked very early. So that's kind of the, if there's one thing that I hope you remember, it is that China led early and it peaked early. And the timing that I'm going to show is much earlier than most of the timings that scholars have come up with. And that's important because to get the timing right has implications for how you think about this issue causally, right? What are the independent variables you're looking at? If you don't get the timing right, you misidentify what is causing the rise and the fall of Chinese technology. So I just kind of repeat, peak very, very early, much earlier. Usually people believe that Chinese began to decline in sort of 13th century. They always blame the Mongols. And people who work on Arabic technology, you talk to them why Arabic civilization used to be extremely innovative and inventive, and they will give you the same answer as the Mongols, Genghis Khan. Well, actually, if we believe our data, I mean, he definitely didn't help, but he didn't cause the first decline, because the first decline happened in the 6th century. So it really matters to get the timing right, as I said before. This is to get the causal mechanisms right. So if you believe that Chinese decline happened in 15th century, so then you look at what happened in China in 15th century. Most people will say, a lot of economists will say, oh, it's the trade closures. It's the voyage bans, very, very famous, right? The Ming Dynasty issued the bans on trade and on voyages. And that lasted for 400 years. A lot of people say that caused the Chinese technology to decline and Chinese economy to decline. If you believe, no, the decline happened in 17th century, and this is a famous name in this literature, Joseph Needham. He kind of, although he's kind of all over the place, but one thing that he consistently said what led to the Chinese decline was the Chinese failure to develop science as compared with the West. So he sort of implicitly put the Chinese decline to 17th century when the West began to develop scientifically. Other people say it may be the science, it may be the voyage ban, but the most immediate dynamic is the suppression of commerce. Then they point to Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty as sort of the peak of suppressing commerce. And that's roughly from 14th century to the beginning of the 20th century. Some historians disagree, they say actually there's quite a bit of commerce going on. So that's not even factually established. Whereas the other ones, 15th century voyage ban, that's factually established. Failure to launch science, that's factually established. So this explanation is quite weak because it's not even factually established that China actually suppressed commerce during Ming and Qing dynasties. And then there's another view, which is that the peak of Chinese civilization and Chinese technology is really Tang Dynasty, right? Kind of 7th century, 10th century, and then Song Dynasty, 10th century to 13th century, right? So that's the kind of the peak of Chinese inventiveness. And then they infer from that, say, let's look at Tang and let's look at Song. What is it that they are so inventive? They are very powerful empires, right? So the idea is that Chinese were strong in technology because of the power of the empire. But my dating of the decline is 6th century, right? So if you believe in that, many of you, well, I'm going to wait to hear what you have to say. You may not be convinced by what I'm going to present. But if you go with that, none of these explanations that I presented is correct, right? So it's just, the timing is totally not matched with the explanations that these scholars have provided. I'm not going to say that I am the only one who argues the decline began in the 6th century, but as far as I know, not many people believe that the decline began so early. So we really need to locate other variables. So that's, I think it's, to some extent, this is a power of data, right? So to get the facts right. And then once you get the facts right, then you begin to construct a more plausible causal explanation, right? So the general theme of my book, and I'm going to apply this to this chapter, is technological development and economic development as a whole depends on getting scale and scope right? So we can think about scale. One easy way to think about scale, and there are other ways, but one easy way to think about scale is government, right? Government is the most powerful actor, and in China especially. And so R&D spending, public sector employment, organization of big projects, coordination, implementation, right? So scale means that you do the same thing at a large quantity and do it consistently, right? So many people sort of compare China with India. India cannot scale, China can scale. So it's in that usage that I'm invoking here, right? But there's also scope, risk-taking. Scope basically, in my mind, is multiple conditions, multiple ideas, multiple ideologies, right? It's basically freedom, right? So the freedom to choose, risk-taking, freedom of explorations, inquiries, questioning authority, right? So kind of a scale, roughly we think about autocracy as better at scale, democracy as better at scope, right? So my kind of overall take is that for economy to succeed, for technology to succeed, you kind of need to get a balance right between these two things. And I would argue that this way of thinking applies to both history and to the current period, right? So I'll be happy to come back to that, but the main presentation is not about the current period. But you may have that question in your mind, how Chinese Communist Party, how can they have scope? Actually, it does, but not in a conventional way. So I'll be happy to come back during the Q&A on this. So let's look at dive more deeply into empirics. So the peak era. So you use the kind of a scope and scale framework. The peak era of technology is associated with political fragmentation, right? Different political regimes competing with each other, different territories competing with each other, and ideological heterogeneity. Multiple ideas rather than just one Confucianist idea, but also there's state capacity. There's also scale, right? It kind of reminds me of what Joe Mokyr calls contestability conditions. A little bit like Europe after the Roman Empire, and I'm going to come back to that later on. The declining eras are associated with political unification, right? So multiple regimes became one. Weakening of ideological diversity during the first decline, and the complete collapse of ideological diversity during the second era of decline. But the state capacity remains relatively stable throughout Chinese history. So that's actually a nice setup, right? Kind of methodologically, it's a nice setup because there are two things that matter, right? Scale and scope. One thing kind of remained the same, the other changed a lot. And then the outcome variable changed a lot. Then you know that it is really the thing that changed that led to the change in the outcome variable rather than the thing that didn't change. Let me talk about the potential contributions of this way of looking at Chinese history, right? So on your screen, on your right, you see the upper kind of picture, upper painting of a Chinese voyage in the 15th century. And it was a massive navigational project led by a eunuch of all things. Eunuch, he went to Africa, he went to South China Sea, he went to Taiwan. It's just 400 ships, tens of thousands of people. At the bottom, you see the ship used by Christopher Columbus. Like very little ships, 7 of them, and very shabby technologically speaking, right? So you can understand what, and then as I said before, the Ming Dynasty banned the further voyages. And so many people argue that China lost its opportunity in the Ming Dynasty. And the counterfactual world is a pax seneca if Ming had allowed the Chinese navigational power to conquer the rest of the world, right? But the problem with that explanation is that China began to decline in the 6th century, long before the possibility of this counterfactual scenario. And China was nowhere near industrialization. So a lot of historians, economic historians, believe that China missed the boat just narrowly. I don't know. I mean, if you call 700 years narrow, that's narrow, but that's not very narrow. And there are lessons from history. Autocracy is detrimental to technology if autocracy sacrifices too much scope, right? And chapter 9 deals with that issue. And the larger kind of idea is that there's really no unique Chinese model. There's no unique Chinese variant. This is, the Chinese succeeded and failed by the same variables that we can use to look at other countries. And my approach, there's no shortage of literature on these questions, but my approach is more empirical, more data-driven. So even if I get to the same place as others, at least the approach is more empirical. Right? So let me talk about the data set. We use 2 source materials to construct the database. One is the Joseph Needham's 27 volumes of Science and Civilization of China. And the other is multiple volumes by Chinese Academy of Sciences. And it's a collaboration with a Tsinghua University professor. And the challenge in doing that is that the texts are all free form. There's no fixed format, and there's no electronic version. So we hired 44 researchers at Tsinghua and to do the initial digital transformation. And then 10 researchers at MIT sort of cataloging, coding, matching the data set. Mostly manual work. I wish I could tell you we use some secret MIT technology. There's nothing, there's no technology that we can use. So it took 6 years. It's relatively massive. The initial run produced about 11,000 inventions, and I'm going to use the 11,000 version of it. It's an earlier version. Now we have 15,000 inventions now. We also, they're missing data, they're inventions, but how you can match them with dynasties. They're not totally clear. So we have a set of coding rules to match these things to dynasties. But today, the data I'm going to present are based on the inventions that we can match with dynasties unambiguously. So we don't need to rely on the coding rules. Once we use the coding rules, the results are not that different. So the missing data, to use the missing data with the coding rules, don't produce results that are different from using the data that are unambiguously matched. Inventions data. So we use Joseph Needham's definition of inventions. It is a very broad concept. So discovery, technical gadget, scientific theory, production method. We don't distinguish those. We just use the word inventions to describe them. And we use the term like science and technology, inventions, innovations very loosely. We just use them to refer to the same thing. People who work on innovations, they will say, oh, invention is different from innovation. That's okay. I mean, we don't need to get into that. It's just, we don't really have any meaningful information to tell which one is invention, which one is innovation. So as such, the data are appropriate to compare different periods of Chinese history rather than comparing China with Europe, right? So because we have cross-time consistency in the definitions, we don't have the cross-sectional consistency in the definitions. In terms of the specific measure, it's a very simple measure. It is the number of inventions of a dynasty divided by the population of that dynasty, right? So we call it the CDI, the Chinese Dynasty Inventiveness Score. And for example, for Qing Dynasty, the CDI is 2.85, which means that there are 2.85 inventions per million population, right? So that's what 2.85 means. So it's a density measure. It's a density measure. The population estimates, Chinese scholars have actually come up with pretty good and thorough population estimates. We use one scholar in particular, but we also use other scholars' estimates to check if they check out with each other, and they do. There's not a big difference. There are a lot of data complications. Let me list them here rather than explaining them, but in the Q&A, if you want to come back, I'll be very happy to come back to this. One is that we treat all the inventions equally, so with the equal weighting. People may say that's not really right. Gunpowder is much more important than something else. We don't bother with that. Different dynasties have different length, right? Some are long, some are short, okay? And then because this is a ratio, right? The population is in the denominator. When you have large population, that ratio comes down. And we have answer for that. And that's a very important issue to deal with, because it turns out the later Chinese dynasties tend to have bigger populations, right? So if you see this decline pattern, you could argue it is a statistical artifact of the way that we construct the measure. And then people say, how about just using the absolute count of the inventions, right? I'll be happy to go back to each one of them, but let me skip them now to get to the more interesting part of the presentation. In terms of ideological measure, 10 minutes, all right, okay, so let me just skip this. We have a measure. Let's show the pattern, right? So this is, so 3 eras, right? 3 eras, the first era, and this is kind of 6th century. And as you can see, it kind of went down in a kind of a stepwise fashion, right? So the CDI average score, okay, so the next one is even more clear. The first era, the CDI average score is 24. It came down dramatically to 9. It came down dramatically to 5, right? So these are the kind of the three declining patterns. Let me talk about the scale. It's actually very interesting. The lot of the literature on Chinese historical technology is about decline. There's actually very little about why the Chinese were able to accomplish so much in the first place, right? So my argument is that the Chinese led early because of the state capacity, because the state supported science and technology. And it supported science and technology in a particular way by putting a lot of the creative talents on the government payroll, right? So it is not like you invent a computer, I gave you $10,000. It is before you invent a computer, I put you on the government payroll. You may invent a computer, you may invent nothing, but you already have that benefit of being on the government payroll, right? What we can show is that the share of the scientists and technologists on the government payroll is at a very high level throughout Chinese history. And so, Francis Fukuyama talks about Chinese kind of a precociousness, right? Political precociousness. And this is one kind of concrete illustration of that precociousness, right? Very early on, they put a lot of inventive, creative people on the government payroll, right? So let me show you some data. This is humanists, right? These are the technologists, right? So this is Chinese history, throughout Chinese history, right? So like 90% of the humanists were on the government payroll. Technologists, 70, 75% were on the government payroll, right? So that's the kind of the state capacity we're talking about. And just think about Asian times, right? So if you're not on the government payroll, then you have to farm, and that's subsistence living. And so it's much better deal to be on the government payroll than farming. Let me talk about the contestability, because I don't have much time. And this is getting to a very interesting period of Chinese history. So essentially the dividing line is before 6th century and after 6th century. So the question is, what happened in China before the 6th century? What happened in China before the 6th century was China was not even united for a long proportion of that period of time. And then there were multiple ideologies going on, right? And the dynasty that reunified China was the Sui dynasty toward the end of the 6th century, 580, toward the end. And Sui basically finished off this kind of a political fragmentation, not just through military conquest, but through inventing the civil service exam. So that's the kind of the rest of the book. I'm not going to talk about the civil service exam, but when you think about the 6th century, the reunification, it's the civil service examination system that not only unified the country, but perpetuated that unification, right? That finished off the later on what I call the Chinese European moment, finished off the political fragmentation, finished off ideological competition. And if you read economic historians explaining Industrial Revolution, one important variable is ideological competition, territorial competition. China, Sui dynasty got rid of that in the 6th century. So if you look at the shocks, the political unification achieved here, ideological reunification achieved here. Okay? And let me show you a graph on empires, right? So Chinese empires, the basic pattern is empires, political unification, large territory. Empires are very bad for technology, right? So you see this kind of downward sloping curve. The bubble is scaled to the size of the empire. The larger the empire is, the more unified the empire is, the worse it does in terms of innovations and inventiveness. I like to highlight this one era in Chinese history, which is extremely interesting. And this is the Han Sui interregnum, and there's an official Chinese name, but I'm not going to bore you with that. I didn't see how much time, 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. And that era lasted from 220 to 580. It has the highest CDI score, 31, right? So if you look at the numbers here below, it is twice as inventive as Song Dynasty. By the way, Song Dynasty invented gunpowder, paper, and sorry, not paper, gunpowder, compass, and the printing. Han Dynasty invented paper, right? So Song Dynasty is usually viewed as the most inventive. It pales in comparison, compared with this era. The ratio to Tang Dynasty is 1.7. The ratio to Han Dynasty is 1.6. So these three dynasties are typically viewed as pretty inventive in Chinese history, right? And the least inventive dynasty in China is Qing Dynasty. It's as 10 times as inventive as Qing Dynasty, right? So here I really benefited from reading Professor Walter Schadell's book, Escape from Rome. China during this period is basically what I say in my book is Europe before Europe was Europe, right? And so Professor Schadell argues that Europe became Europe today because of the collapse of Roman Empire in 476. Remarkably, 100 years later, China went in the total opposite direction, right? China had a European moment, but then they went in the total opposite direction 100 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And this is the Sui-Han period, remarkably similar to Europe after the Roman Empire. Political fragmentation, there were 31 kind of concurrent and consecutive regimes. A lot of argumentation, right? A pure talk, a very famous concept in Chinese history, a version of the discussion democracy, abstract thinking, right? So one criticism of Chinese philosophy is that it's not abstract. That's the period when the Chinese thinking was most abstract. Two most accomplished mathematicians, kind of fundamental math, was during this period, right? I just don't think this is a coincidence. And intellectuals were more independent of the state than intellectuals in the later era. And there was a flushing of humanities and technology. So kind of Renaissance era of China. A lot of people like Ian Morris, he said Song Dynasty was the Chinese Renaissance. Actually, that's not true at all. It is this era that is the Chinese Renaissance. Both humanities and technologies flourished. So we have a measure of humanistic creations, and this is the number of the literary works created during the different dynasties. Again, Han Sui scored the highest number on the humanistic creativity side, right? And they scored the highest number in terms of technology, right? So, you know, if you study European history, this is not a pattern that will surprise you. Both of these things go hand in hand with each other. The second highest CDI score is achieved by the Warring States period. And this is a famous period, right? So Axial Age, different philosophies, and territorial competition, very famous in Chinese history. Most people believe that China finished ideological diversity after the Warring States period. And according to our database, actually China revived that during the Han Sui period between 220 to 580. Okay, so so 0 moments. Let me just show you some, this is Buddhism. It peaked, it was at very high level at the Han Sui interaction, but not at the peak. But I can go into that, why this is so. This is Taoism, share of Taoist believers. It began to decline in the second era of Chinese decline, in the third era of Chinese technology, right? Buddhism began to decline during the second era. So this is how I kind of view it. The political unification made China less innovative, less inventive. And then you have ideological homogeneity, and that came in through 2 waves. The first wave was matched with the first decline. The second wave was matched with the second decline. Okay, let me get to the finishing point. And this is just another graph from Chinese scholars, show you exactly the same thing, okay? Okay, so let me just finish there and just implications for today. The basic implication for today is, before Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party actually figured out a pragmatic approach how to promote science and technology by essentially using Hong Kong, collaborations with Stanford and collaborations with MIT, collaborations with Western universities, right? And Xi Jinping came along and he undermined Hong Kong. In my chapter 9, I talked about exactly how Hong Kong contributed to Chinese technology. He undermined Hong Kong. He's undermining scientific collaborations between Chinese universities and Western universities. My prediction for Chinese technological future is that it is entering into this kind of technological decline period because of these actions that Xi Jinping has taken. Okay, let me finish there. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much, Yasheng, for that really interesting, this new project, this ridiculously comprehensive data set. So we have a lot of questions coming in on Q&A and probably some in the room. Raise your hand if you have any. We'll start with Frank.
Should I unshare my screen? Okay, it's already, yeah, okay.
And if everyone who asks a question here could introduce yourself first, and I'll do the same for the people who are doing the Zoom Q&A.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Yasheng. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions. First of all, so you're right that this is exactly Walter Scheibel's thesis about Rome. I mean, you're applying it to China, and it makes a lot of sense, in terms of the distribution. I mean, if conflict itself actually produces a lot of innovation, and you can see why that would be true. I would say, though, that your correlation is not all that perfect. So, for example, in the Tang Song transition, before the Northern Song dynasty, you have the period of 5 dynasties, and that should have been also a period of innovation. And your bar, I mean, actually everything drops in that period. And so it kind of does the opposite of the theory. But I guess the question I have is, why are you using inventions per million people as a measure of overall inventiveness? Because if you think about other societies, like ancient Athens had a population well under 1 million people, and you look at how productive it was, or interwar Budapest produced 4 Nobel Prize winning physicists, this tiny little city in the middle of Europe. And so it seems to me that inventiveness, I mean, obviously a big country can produce more scientists than a small country, but there's something else going on that that really produces inventive societies. It's shouldn't be particularly linked to to population.
Yeah, actually, my measure shows that the larger dynasties in terms of population have lower level of inventiveness, right? So this is, it kind of runs counter to the idea, more people, more ideas, right? So at least the starting premise is that there's a fixed proportion of, smart people, intelligent people, inventive people in any given population, right? And so comparing countries with countries, that's a little bit tricky because, DNA is different, all these things are different. But compared with the same country, you need to control for the population size, right? If you start with the premise that the proportion of inventive people to the whole population is relatively fixed, right? So let me give you an example. So if you look at Russia, right? Russia files many, many patents, right? So I think 2019 data will tell you they file 30,000 patents. Singapore, 7,000, right? So if you just look at the absolute number, well, Russia is more inventive, but that clearly is not right? Because Russia has, I forgot what the population of Russia,
142 million.
142 million, okay. And Singapore, 7 million, right? So you have to control the population. And this is a measure most people use to control. For example, you can sort of scale the patents by the number of university professors, right? By the number of researchers, by the college students. I think the criticism is I use population rather than using the potential researchers, potential inventive segment of the population. The reason is I really don't know who they are, and I don't have that number. So I use just the gross population. So that's if you look at the World Bank measure, it is also scaled by when they measure entrepreneurship, right? How entrepreneurial a country is. What they do is they use the newly established business units scaled by the working age population. I think there's a kind of a deeper discussion here, which is that when you do that, you assume that every single one of the member of the population is capable of launching a new business, right? So that's why they use the working age population. And so for the historical work, it's actually not a bad idea to use the whole population rather than using a segment of the population, because this is not like a DARPA. This is not a National Science Foundation. Every single Chinese in the Han Dynasty had the potential to come up with something, right? Because he or she is not a researcher, he or she is not a university professor. There's no government program specifically to support the project. So should treat the whole population as potential, each one of them as potential inventor. When that population gets large, the size of the potential inventors also gets large. So that's why you need to scale it.
So we have a two-finger here before we have more questions in the room and more questions in the Q&A, but we have a two-finger here from Samitra Jha, Sanja at the GSB and also at CDDRL. So he's also asking about this Malthusian aspect of your theory, that if inventions are productive, then in a Malthusian world, that would result in higher population carrying capacity. So by normalizing by population, are you missing a key potential benefit that innovations enable China to support a larger population for a given set of resources? And he's also asking, as a follow-up to this discussion with Frank, if your results change if you scale by urban population.
Yeah, so that's a very good suggestion. let me plead for forgiveness for one. We're talking about 2,000 years of Chinese history, and if I have an ideal pick of all the variables I can have, yes, there are multiple ways of doing this, right? So just to get an estimate of Chinese population for a dynasty, it is a non-trivia. So Professor Ge, he's like a revered professor in China because he has come up with a more or less complete estimate of population. Urban population, we just simply don't have that. I was looking for urban population, we just don't. We have some of that for Song Dynasty, a little bit of Ming Dynasty, but we can't really go back much beyond that. In terms of the Malthusian idea, the Malthusian logic is, I mean, if we believe Malthusian logic, is larger population reduces productivity, right? And so it's very interesting. In the past, when I gave this seminar, people usually attack me from the opposite direction, which is that I artificially lowered the inventiveness of the Qing dynasty because Qing dynasty has a very large population, right? And if that criticism is correct, then that's based on Malthusian logic, right? So larger population reduces inventiveness, reduces productivity. So Malthusian logic is just not supported by data. Larger population is not associated with lower productivity. It's not associated with lower inventiveness. Joe Mulcair actually shows that in Europe, when the population doubled, agricultural population doubled, there was no change in productivity, and there's probably improvement in productivity, right? So, and the person who asked this question gets it exactly right, right? The lower CDI scores, not all of them. Frank, I can come back to the five dynasty issue, but quite like 2 dynasties that have very low CDI scores have very large populations. You would think that if you start with the idea larger populations can support productivity improvement, you shouldn't expect to see that outcome, right? You should see the inventiveness either increase or hold steady. What we see in the data is that it is declining dramatically, right? So if you think about the production function of inventions, innovations, and technology, population and things like that are one factor, but there are lots of other factors, right? So the factors I want to highlight have to do with the government support, have to do with freedom of explorations and academic freedom, research freedom. When you have larger population, but you have autocracy, right? Just like China during the Cultural Revolution, when you have larger population, when you have autocracy, you prevent people from thinking, new ideas and things like that. Even a larger population is not going to give you a lot of innovations and technology. So that's kind of the idea. Right. That I'm trying to demonstrate.
Excellent, excellent. We have a few other questions, so let's go ahead and get to them, Catherine.
Oh, sure. So actually, great segue, Yasheng, and it's nice to see you. Sorry, we're not welcoming you here in person, and it's nice that we can see your face if you can't see ours. But so super interesting, and I want to take off on the point that you just made, actually, which is this kind of relationship between regime type and creativity and also state capacity. So I didn't hear a definition of state capacity from you. So I'd like to hear that. And I think it's important because clearly you mean funding or state support. And so you would need a capacious state in some way to provide that funding. And then second, an administration that's capable of spending that funding or identifying creative people and creating conditions under which they can think freely. So, so if I understand your theory right, this is what would enhance inventiveness. how these things work together. So I'm fascinated by this, but of course, as a a student of another, of another formerly communist country, and I think about Stalin in that period, and I wouldn't be able to periodize in the way that you have over Russian history about when it was most creative, but they have their creation, their sort of scientific inventiveness periods as well. So what kind of state, under Stalin, they get the bomb, they, create a whole bunch of other things. In the Soviet period, they really, because they missed the Enlightenment, they missed the Industrial Revolution, all of this comes late, it comes in the 30s to the 50s, basically. So how to think about that? It's not what the story you're describing. It's in fact a space that's very closed in terms of freedom of thinking.
Sure.
It's a state with a certain kind of capacity that is repressive. So, but it seems as though it took its own great leap forward in this period under those conditions. And then, anyway, I'll stop with that.
Hold on, Yasheng, since we have other good questions to get to on Zoom, I'm going to group these questions here, okay, with Dinsha Mystery.
Hi, Yasheng.
Yeah.
My question actually dovetails with Catherine's. It's basically, is there any kind of way we can sort of separate out either the ruler or the dynasty's preference for science, right? Because if that's driving it, say somebody is just a scientific nerd or something, probably likely to support that a lot more. And that's a different dynamic than if there's competition that's resulting in all these sorts of things and we need science to fight randomly or whatever it might be.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, excellent questions. So Soviet Union, I think it's so you are an expert on Soviet Union and I'm not. It is an example of kind of, and China historically, so under Mao, they had nuclear weapons and the satellite. So that kind of autocratic setting is extremely good at big projects. Right? So the kind of the scale, right? The scale advantage. And this is where we are suffering now in the United States, right? Think about the big data, right? The Manhattan Project, right? It's hard to imagine Manhattan Project to be driven by incremental faculty kind of lab individual inventions and that kind of model, right? So you can kind of sort of single out certain projects that are particularly amenable to the state scaling interventions of that nature, right? And Soviet Union excelled in those. Mao's China not excelled, but they also made more progress than they did in other areas. But this is not a type of system that produces the internet, right? The breakthroughs of technologies, right? So it's mostly about scaling, and Soviet Union has a huge advantage in that. And there's a book, I'm sure you know the book by Lauren Graham, The Lonely Ideas, and that's another problem with that model, which is that you invented things, but you never deployed them, right, to reap the commercial and economic gains from the inventions. So essentially, for the society as a whole, this is not a very good investment, right? So you spend a lot of money on certain things, you get zero returns from these investments. Sooner or later, you run out of the economic viability, as Soviet Union did, as Mao's China did, right? So that's just not a very sustainable model. So even though they were inventive in a sense that I carefully described, right? Big projects and big applications of science to massive applications. But that's not a very viable model going forward. And the collapse of Soviet Union clearly shows that the country derived zero economic benefits from the kind of physics that they did, from kind of nuclear physics that they did, and all the scientific breakthroughs that they accomplished, right? So I don't think Soviet Union takes away this idea that you need both the scale and the scope, right? Especially if you look at Soviet Union over a longer period of time. I mean, in the end, I don't think anybody here would defend the Soviet model. It collapsed, right? So how can an economic and technological superpower, how can we showcase a technological power of a country if the end result of that is collapse, right? So it's a totally failed model, even though when it was going, it has some impressive achievements. On the rulers and that, yeah, so that would require really detailed information, you know. So we have so some of the papers I'm doing now are looking at regimes at the ruler level rather than at the dynasty level. So we have actually compiled a data set on emperors and as well as their senior ministers. Again, you know, it's just, I can tell stories, right? So some of the Qing, so what's very interesting is that Qing dynasty, which has the lowest CDI score in my database, in 2.8, something like that. They had two emperors who were very enamored of technology, very enamored of technology, the clocks and things like that. But he treated that as a personal hobby, right? Rather than as a way to improve the economy, to improve the military strength of the country. And he was very interested in math. He hired a missionary to teach him math and teach him English, but at the same time, he banned the dissemination of the same knowledge to the population, right? So I even though, you know, I haven't run the data, but I don't think those personal preferences explain any of the patterns that I show here, right? So, I mean, essentially the pattern that I show is earlier you have the peak and then you have the decline. Whereas the preferences of the emperors are kind of randomly distributed throughout the Chinese history. You may have some earlier emperors who didn't like science. You may have some later emperors who liked the science. But from the pattern that I can construct from the data, clearly this is not a random. This is not a random pattern, right? So it's not like this. It's really that. So I don't think the ruler, to be honest, I don't think the ruler preferences, even without knowing the facts, I would say the ruler preferences don't explain.
Okay, so we have just, as a final set of questions, Walter Shael on Zoom is asking how your invention score, which gives equal weight to each case, accommodates the idea of macro inventions by Joel Mokyr. And also as a second thing, I'll group questions from our colleagues, Steve Krasner and Karis Templeman, about how your theory fits in with the broader work on the political economy of development, particularly by Acemoglu and Robinson, or even Jared Diamond, people who are looking at the factors of interstate warfare or geographic isolation and other things like state institutions that help to determine trajectories of growth. How do you sort of slot your work into that? So yes.
Yeah. Very good question. So thank you for the question about equal weight, equal weighting. It's very important to explain why I did that. One is, again, I'm pleading for forgiveness. We have 11,000, and the latest run is we have 15,000 inventions. I really have no way of sort of the
sorry, our camera is like falling behind the television screen. So we turned off our video only because you're just going to be looking at a ceiling.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that, Yasheng.
Oh, I thought it's because we don't have 5G.
We've all been vaccinated.
And so we, 11,000, 15,000. I don't have the capability of assigning weights to these inventions, except for the few very well-known ones, right? The paper, the printing, the gunpowder, and things like that. But let's just stay with the significant ones, the ones we know. Actually, I don't know if people know this, brandy was invented by the Chinese. Umbrella was invented by the Chinese. Toilet paper was invented by the Chinese, right? So, I mean, how do I weigh whiskey and brandy against toilet paper? I don't know. Maybe during the pandemic, I weighed toilet paper more. I don't know. Maybe brandy more, right? So who knows? So it's other than just the few ones. There's really I know that there are people who do this by backing out their economic importance from modern applications, right? So they look at the patent citations and things like that. I can't do that, and with the kind of the data that I have. But let's back up a little bit, right? So let's just assume that we can tell one invention is more important than the other invention. It's important to point out the reason why we say paper is more important than other inventions, gunpowder is more important than other inventions, compass is more important than other inventions. It's because of their economic impact. It's because of their deployment. Where did the deployment happen? They happen in Europe. They happen in Europe. Chinese didn't deploy these technologies for any meaningful economic gains, for any meaningful commercial developments, right? So essentially ex ante, it's not correct to say that Song dynasty is more inventive than another dynasty because it has invented gunpowder, compass, and printing. Because the way that we measure importance is by their economic deployment. None of these technologies in Chinese history were ever deployed, right? So in that sense, gunpowder is just as important as toilet paper. It's just as important as brandy, right? And so there's a sort of an empirical answer to that, and there's a conceptual answer to that. In terms of linking with a bigger literature, I think with Darren's work, maybe there's a little bit of, I would link this more with Waters' work, political competition, contestations, with John Mulcair's work, and then the scholars you cited, Diamond and Darren. To the extent there is a linkage, the linkage with Darren is more his more recent book, which is kind of a narrow corridor, right? So it's really hard to get it right. Balancing the scale with scope. And many governments fail, US failed in terms of getting the scale right. I mean, in US, we're not short of academic freedom, but we have done terrible disservice to technology and science by not investing in R&D, right? And whereas China probably has the opposite combination of policy mistakes, right? So they emphasize the scale at the expense of the scope, right? So where's that sweet spot of getting it both the scale and the scope right? I would say that's a very narrow window. And actually I use that term in my book. Just think about from the Communist Party's perspective, right? To keep the kind of technological progress that they have made, you got to preserve the autonomy of Hong Kong. You got to have some got to have a good working relationship with the West. You got to give some room to the entrepreneurs, to Jack Ma and to those people, right? And, you know, the Chinese Communist Party for 30 years tolerated that, but not the current leader, right? So he cracked down on the private sector. You know, in my book, I talk about this, right? So essentially biting the hand that feeds you. It was the private sector who came up with the health codes to deal with the COVID response. It is the private sector that led to the big data revolution in China. He is actually demolishing the engine of technological improvement. It is Hong Kong that provided property rights security, provided efficient financing and capital to the high-tech entrepreneur. He's demolishing all of that, right? So it's not easy to get it right. So I you know, maybe I can think about other linkages, but this is one linkage that I can think with Darren's work. Why nations fail? I'll think harder about that. How my work connects with that. I can't think of a very obvious connection to that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for presenting your research today and for being patient with us through some camera troubles. It was really wonderful to hear your talk. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to our audience, both online and in the room.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.